Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar on returning to Ireland. This is the first session in a three-part series, and my name is Una, and I'm from the Irish Support Agency, and I am delighted to be joined by Sarah Owen and Richard King from the Crosscare Migrant Project. Before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that I am hosting this webinar on the lands of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. And I would also like to acknowledge the lands that you are watching this webinar from. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So just before we get started, there will be some time allocated at the end for your own personal questions. Just bear in mind that this webinar is being recorded. So if there are personal circumstances in which you don't want to share in the public domain, please feel free to get in touch with the Migrant Project directly, and their contact details will be in the chat box, but you'll also see further details in the presentation. If you have any questions throughout the presentation on something in particular, please also feel free to pop that into the chat box, and we will try to incorporate it as we go along. But if not, we will obviously answer that at the end. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. I'm delighted to hand it over to Sarah, and she will get started.
Thank you very much, Una. I might get you to just change to the next slide. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Una. So this evening, we're going to be discussing immigration requirements for Australian spouses and de facto partners. We will touch on civil partners a little bit, but we'll be focusing more on the other two. So we'll chat a little bit about who we are and what we do. A little bit on trends in Irish return migration, which you may or may not be aware of, just to set some context. And then we'll go into more detail on the subject at hand. We'll also be sharing useful resources and contact details at the end of this presentation. And as Una said, there will be the opportunity to ask questions. So do please go ahead and do that if you have any. Next slide, please. So who are we and what do we do? So Crosscare Migrant Project is the organisation I and Richard work for. We're based in Dublin and we're funded by the Irish government's Emigrant Support Programme. That ESP programme funds, I think, over 500 groups, Irish organisations around the world, of which ourselves and the Irish Support Agency are two. So we were established in 1987 as Emigrant Advice, and we've been working with Irish immigrants since the 80s. We do have some experience in this area. We're also a project of Crosscare, which is a large social care service provider in the Dublin region. So if you're from Dublin, you may have heard of our parent organisation. What we do is we provide information, advocacy and referral supports to Irish immigrants and returning immigrants. And our focus is particularly on people returning in vulnerable situations, but we do provide information to anyone both leaving the country and returning home in order to help make an informed decision about migration. Something else that we do is we collaborate with organisations like the Irish Support Agency to offer training and events like today. And we also conduct research and undertake social policy campaigns. So we were recently in the Houses of the Oireachtas speaking to members of one of the committees about barriers for returning Irish immigrants. And if that's of interest, you can watch the video back on our website, which is migrantproject.ie. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of context, currently, as of the latest statistics, which were issued in 2021, there are more people returning to Ireland than there are leaving the country. I don't know if that comes as a surprise. It might not. We're hearing a lot about people in Australia who have been there for a number of years and are now looking to return. There's obviously lots of reasons for that, but the main reasons that we find at present are the effect of the pandemic. So Australia is quite far away, and understandably, the distance has, I suppose, been made more apparent by the pandemic. And I know your borders have only just recently reopened, so that's part of the trend, I suppose. And then there are opportunities emerging in various different employment sectors in Ireland. And more often than not, the main reason that people are coming home is to be closer to family. So some of those things might resonate with you all on this call. Just a few things to consider when planning your return home. It can seem overwhelming at the beginning. Depending on what stage you're at, some of these tips might come in handy. So obviously, plan and do as much research as you can before you move back. And ideally before you've even made the decision to move back. Look at the pros and cons, what works best for you and for your family circumstances. Do what you can beforehand. This is a key thing. There are a lot of statutory services that, although you cannot apply for things before you return, you can actually get the forms and start the process and look at things like, where's my PPS number? Do your children need PPS number? You can start some of those things beforehand. This is especially crucial with some of the immigration requirements that Richard's going to go into. Having savings and budgeting for your return. Look at the cost of living in Ireland. You'll find that it's probably gone up since you were last in Ireland, but may not be at quite the same levels as some of the costs in Australia. So it's a balance, I suppose. Try and have realistic expectations. Now, this is something that we try and emphasize to people, because once you returning home, yes, but you're also re-emigrating. So the things that you would have had to establish when you were in Australia, it's going to be a little bit similar when you're back in Ireland. Although you have various networks already established, there is going to be a period of readjustment, and it can sometimes take longer than people think to actually get settled and to readjust to life in Ireland. I think this quote at the bottom says it best. Talk to others who have done it, but mostly take your time with the decision and think about why you are doing it. Next slide, please. I'll hand over to Richard now.
Great, thanks Sarah, thanks Una, and hi all. I'm going to talk through some of the immigration processes for spouses and civil partners. I'm going to work on the assumption, rightly or wrongly, that this is going to be mainly relevant to Irish people with Australian spouses or civil partners or de facto partners, but I will mention visa required people as well, because the good part of this process is that if your spouse or civil partner is Australian, they don't need a visa. So there is very little work to do in advance of coming to Ireland. But if you are married to, let's say, a Vietnamese citizen, they are actually going to have to apply for a visa in advance. So there is a whole online process for visas. I'm not going to talk through too much of that, because actually a lot of it's just basic information, and we'll put some of the links up as well. But the key thing for everyone, visa or non-visa required, is that you have proof of the relationship. So if you're married, it's pretty easy. It's a marriage cert in general, and that there's some basic financial criteria to be met. The criteria are it's a pretty low bar, actually. The financial requirements is for the sponsor, but also the sponsor and perhaps their spouse, to have earned €40,000 over a period of 3 years. So that amounts to about €13,500 per year. So if anyone is working, they're probably almost guaranteed to meet that amount. And if they aren't, or there's mitigating circumstances, there are ways to get around it. So if we're working on the basis that there's no visa required, there's a little bit of prep in advance of coming back, but that is mainly just getting some of that documentation together. And it's a really good idea to maybe get, if you've been living together, to get proof of renting or co-ownership, and if you have things like joint bank accounts, to get some bank statements. They're useful things anyway at the best of times, but they'll also help when you come to register at the immigration officer in Ireland. So when you fly into Ireland, you probably end up coming through Dublin, almost guaranteed. It's quite simple at border control. There'll be the non-EU line to go through, and it's best usually for the non-EU person to go first, and they stayed at the border. I'm coming to Ireland to live with my Irish spouse, and your Irish spouse is hopefully going to be in the queue behind them. And probably what will happen is the immigration officer border control might at that point look for a marriage cert or something like that. And then they don't make the decision at that point. So they should grant entry, and it's usually up to 90 days. And that entry is entry on the basis of then going to register the permission. And that's very important, because it's very easy to get into the country on a tourist visa and say, hey, I'm just coming to visit Ireland, or someone in Ireland, or coming with family. You need to state the intention, which is to apply for residency permission. Once that's done, you are then required to meet the immigration officer. And there's actually two processes for that, whether you're in Dublin or outside Dublin. So this is it's important to know, it's one of the few things you can do a little bit of preparation in advance around. In Dublin, you have to book an appointment, and usually there's an online appointment process. They've had some problems with that. So at the moment, it's just a phone number. You make a phone call and you book your appointment. And in fact, I think you're supposed to do it while you're in Ireland, but you can do it from outside Ireland. And there's about a 3-month lead in to getting appointments at the moment. This fluctuates. It can increase or decrease, but for the last few months, it's averaged around 3 months. So we're just saying to people is make the call and just say you need to make an appointment to register based on your Irish spouse, and they'll give you an appointment time and date, and you can kind of plan that for, shortly after your arrival. Outside of Dublin, it's through the local Garda headquarters. And the same kind of applies, except it's a little bit more loose, because some Garda headquarters might have a part-time immigration officer, some might have a full-time. So you need to contact the headquarters that's relevant for your area. You need to find out where the immigration officer is on duty or not. If they're on leave for 2 weeks, you're definitely not going to get to see anyone. And you can probably book an appointment quite easily. And look, if you have family back home, or if you're going to be going back to stay with family, then maybe get them to make the call. It's no harm just having your kind of name in someone's mind, and it'll make things a little bit easier. And what happens then when you meet the immigration officer is they go through the basic checks. They want to see the marriage cert, they'll ask some questions, they might want to see the financial criteria, but it's actually quite an easy process for spouses, and especially for non-visa required ones. Honestly, we very rarely hear of issues where people meet the basic criteria. It's usually quite straightforward. They will require you to have some sort of address in Ireland, but this doesn't have to be permanent. If you're staying in a hotel or temporary place or staying with family, you just get something to show that. If it's a hotel booking. If it's family, get them to write a brief letter saying you're staying with them, and that'll just show your residence at the time of registering. And that's important because after registering, they take like biometrics and a photograph and fingerprints, and then they'll send the card to that address. So you do need to have a safe address as well to send the card to. It's I know lots of people who've done the reverse process and have gone through Australian immigration find the Irish system quite easygoing, and in lots of ways it is. It's not a particularly combative one. As long as they're satisfied that it's a genuine relationship and you meet the criteria, there shouldn't really be any problems. If there's a big criminal background or you're on some Interpol watch list, yeah, you might have some issues then, but generally speaking, it's totally fine. And also, there's no cost. There's no cost to get in. There's no cost to register. It's actually a very kind of it's quite a friendly process in a way, but don't just breeze it. You need to be prepared, because they are immigration officers. If they don't like the sound of what you're telling them, if they think maybe it's a marriage inconvenience for some reason, then they are able to pass it up the line, and you'll be stuck making a written application to the immigration headquarters, which can take up to a year. So the best thing is to just do a little bit of prep. We have a bunch of links a little bit later on, but I'm not going to talk through everything, but it describes all those processes and what's needed as well. So I'm going to get on to de facto relationships now. Ruth, that's actually the next one I'm going to spend a little bit more time on. So if you want to move on, Una, there's the next slide, that would be great. De facto relationships are increasingly more common in terms of people coming to us and asking us questions. So there is a distinctly different process here. Absolute key criteria is 2 years cohabitation, okay? Now, there's a tiny little caveat there as well. If someone is registered in a de facto relationship, if you can register it in Australia, sorry, I'm not familiar with the systems in every other country. In Ireland, you don't register a de facto relationship. It has to be proved. If you can register it, well, then that can be one of the proofs used. But the criteria is generally 2 years cohabitation. because they're looking for a relationship that's akin to marriage. And the easiest way to prove this is living together, prove your finances and prove your relationship. Same criteria, 40,000 over 3 years. The relationship can be proved through a variety of means. Some people put up Facebook timelines, they get letters from friends and family, they submit photographs, they show that they've traveled together to various places. Living together is the easiest way to do it. It's a little bit more of an intrusive process maybe, but it is important to give enough information that it does prove the relationship is genuine. I mean, people can live together in the same apartment as friends, but not as partners. So you might need to add that extra bit of information on. And when in doubt, provide a little bit more information than maybe you think. So, you don't have to go into every single text message or message that you've sent. But sometimes that kind of communication backwards and forwards in those records can be really useful, because it just shows, that there is a relationship, and it's a relatively easy way to prove it. Usually people have enough of that evidence these days. So the process is through an online application, and confusingly, the online application is the same as the visa portal. But the key thing here is, for de facto partners, whether you're visa required or non-visa required, you have to do this pre-clearance. So you have to go through this online application, which is just kind of basic information. It's not particularly problematic. But once the online application is done, you then submit the documents. They usually go to the embassy in the Irish embassy or Irish consulate, whichever one is closest, and then they will send those documents back to Dublin, and then it's processed in Dublin. So there's a lot of, that's where the proof of living together, the proof of the relationship, the proof of finances, that's where all that information is submitted, and that backs up what you've written. And what we say to people as well is, look, write up a timeline of your relationship if you need to. If you've only been living together for just 2 years on the dot, but you've been going out for a little bit longer, well then literally write this up, write up a nice bullet pointed timeline saying we met on this date, we started dating, we moved in at this date, and try and link it to bits of evidence like, here's our first rent agreement, here's a photograph of us on our first date, here's our, relationship status changed on Facebook. These are all things that can be done, and there is guidance in more detail given on that. Once the application is done, you're looking at, again, a variable processing time. This one's a little bit frustrating for us, because up to a few months ago, we were hearing people getting it sorted in 10 weeks. And then all of a sudden, processing time changed to 6 months. 6 months was always supposed to be the standard, but actually it was always less than that. At the moment, it's 6 months, and that's there's no real way around that, So you have to factor that into the decision about travel times. Now, once the application is granted, and let's just assume it's granted, you get a letter, a pre-clearance letter, and it will state exactly what you're entitled to, and then you show that at the border control. You don't have to travel together. If for some reason the Irish partner had to come back first, that's okay. It's not required that you travel together, and we've dealt with lots of people where one person comes back first, they get themselves set up, they find somewhere to live, whatever it might be, and then the person back in Australia just waits that little bit longer. Not ideal, obviously, if you're looking at renting 2 places, but it's doable. So don't work on the basis that you have to be traveling together. It's possible to do it otherwise. Same rules apply for dealing with immigration border control, but this time you will be coming with a letter saying you have pre-clearance to enter Ireland. So it'll be very obvious to border control what you're coming to do, and then the same process for residency permission. But because nearly all the work has been done in advance, you should find it a very simple process. That said, everything that you provide for the application, just have it with you, because the immigration officer is entitled to ask for all that stuff again at the meeting. I don't think it's very likely, but if you've gone to all the work of preparing a whole application and having a whole proof relationship, just keep a copy. And don't assume that the officer you're meeting will have access to everything you sent in, because they're actually, if you're outside of Dublin, they cannot see any of those files. They can't look at their system and go, here's like the 200 pages that someone prints out of their Facebook timeline, if you go to that extent. I see there's a question there with from Paul, and yet I think we will keep that actually to the end of the session, because it's quite a relevant one. And I think some of the things I'm coming to might answer that. So Una, would you mind just popping on to the next slide, please? Sorry, I should add while that's happening, if the pre-clearance is refused, there is an appeal process, okay? And they will give you all the reasons it's refused. And if they just feel like, we've seen refusals like, look, we think you have 1 year and 10 months cohabitation, you don't meet the criteria, that is not it's not a deal breaker for future applications. You can just do it again when you do meet the criteria. So a refusal is not going to, it's not going to scupper future chances. And ideally, it'll show you the shortfalls in your application, if there are any, and you can meet those for a future application. So if you don't meet the 2 years cohabitation, but it's still like, maybe there's a great job offer for the Irish citizen back in Ireland and you want to make the move, there are ways to look at alternative immigration permissions. And Paul, this feeds back into your question of what if you're already in Ireland? Because if you're in Ireland already on some other immigration permission, like a working holiday or work permit or a study visa, then there is a separate de facto application process that you can do. So what we have seen is some people come in on, let's say, a work permit, they find a job, they get a permit for it. They have a 1.5 year cohabitation in Australia, they come to Ireland, they build up the next 6 months, then they make their de facto application. So there's kind of ways around it. And look, these are the sort of things that we'd always say, just get in contact with us and we'll chat through the options, because the great thing about what we can do is we can actually talk to you by email or by Zoom or by phone or whatever, and we can chat through what your own particular circumstances are and look at any of those routes. These are not like, these routes aren't gaming the system, they're all legitimate routes that just build up to trying to get the best type of permission that gives the best options for the longest term residency, with the ability to do what anyone wants, you know. Study visas are quite restricted, work permits are limited to one job, but if you come in on that and move on to something else, and move on to the de facto one, well, then you can work in any job and there's no limitations. If you've entered on a tourist visa, it's very, very difficult to change that. So I don't know what your scenario is, Paul, and you don't necessarily have to talk about it here or disclose any of that. But if someone came in just on a visit visa and tried to make an application for de facto permission, we'd be quite concerned it might be refused. And in those cases, we'd probably be saying you need to maybe go out and do that pre-clearance application. But if they've come on some other type of permission, well then forget pre-clearance, they're in Ireland and there's a whole other different route to doing it, effectively the same criteria, but we can talk about that and we can go through it. To mention family members, just to throw something in that people might have come across, if you have children born in Australia but who need to go on the foreign birth registration in order to get a passport, that's a massively long process at the time, at this moment in time. But also don't worry about it, because they can just come to Ireland as your dependent. And also the same applies to adult dependents, but that gets a little bit trickier. Adult dependents are usually children under 23 in full-time education. We probably want to talk in a little bit more detail about that. Don't discount them, there are possibilities. But if they do not have Irish passports, then we need to just look into the specific requirements and make sure that there's a clear, easy route, because the best way to approach everything with immigration all the time is to try and get it right at the start, and then everything flows from there. Whereas if you do it like kind of backwards around, you can hit the blocks, and the blocks in Ireland when it comes to immigration, the flip side of the system being relatively, you know, easygoing and friendly, is that it can also take ages. And if you don't fit into the system neatly and do it legally, you might just get into a 12-month queue or longer, which really limits what everyone can do, you know. So got a couple of questions there, actually. One from Darren as well, about having gone through the Australian partner permanent residence visa and having subsequently obtained Australian citizenship. Ireland has no problem with dual citizenship, and that in that case, if you want to sponsor someone, if I'm correct in interpreting your question, you'd just be sponsoring them as an Irish citizen, and you're going through the Australian partner permanent residence thing will probably just be good evidence of the relationship, really. Come back to me if I haven't understood that correctly. Great. Okay, so your wife's Australian. So look, yeah, I think in that case, it's you have an Australian citizenship, has no negative impact, and doesn't really come into the mix. And your previous immigration history is from Newcastle. Very good. Yeah, your previous immigration history is fine. It'll just be helpful, you know. I think do I have one more slide there? I do, one more slide in, if you wouldn't mind. And the reason I'm putting this one up is because the official immigration website is a little bit confusing when you go in to search the link. So I've tried to make these bespoke so that they're relevant to exactly for what you want to do. So the first one is straightforward. It's de facto partners. Here's the starting process. The second link is the online form, which, as I said, is a bit confusing. It's called a visa form, but actually it is the pre-clearance application route, just for the online information. The general criteria for spouses and civil partners is the third link, and that's just where you can see what's officially required. The fourth link then is the documents and the process for non-visa required, which basically is talking about going to your local immigration office and what documents you need to show. And then the last two are links to how to get an appointment to register your permission, whether you're in Dublin or outside of Dublin. And like I said, you can do this in advance to some extent, and it's definitely worth doing. If you're coming with a non-visa required spouse and you've basically no preparation for anything else to do in advance, one thing you have to do is look at this registering thing and just try and set it up, because if you can get it early on, then that sorts everything out. It's the immigration permission that your spouse or partner gets that then gives them the right to work, right to set up a business, ease of traveling in and out of Ireland, and all those types of things. And you know, there's a bit of a difference. You could, if you don't get it sorted in advance, you could end up waiting 3-4 months, and maybe that's fine. But if you want to start work real quick, try and get this sorted as quickly as you can. I think that's the end of my slides there. I've kind of flown through that at a really fast speed, trying to, you know, tag all the various things. But like, one of the messages is, look at the official information, then just come and talk to us. Like, we can set up a Zoom meeting. I do that all the time, no problems. And we can talk through any of the options, especially if there's any complications or you have any concerns. I can't do the application for you, but I can definitely guide you on it and work out kind of best routes if there's something a little bit complicated or tricky. So that's what we're here for. You can contact us, and we can help with that along with other things, but that's not tonight's subject matter. So any other questions, just throw them in there. Thanks. That's one from Ruth, actually. Yeah. Yes. When you have the immigration appointment, assuming they're happy with this, they will grant it immediately, and there is a couple of weeks wait for them to send out this little thing called a Irish residence permit card. It's like a credit card shaped thing, which is your immigration permission. So yeah, the permission should be granted straight away, and then a couple of weeks later you get the card that everyone recognizes. And actually the same applies outside of Dublin, just it might take a week or so longer, because they only send off cards to be printed at the end of every week or something. But you can be fairly sure that it'll be quick after the appointment.
Richard, I might just add a question that we received in advance of this webinar.
So
the question was, does my passport need to be valid for a certain amount of time on my return?
Okay, so yeah, look, we'll assume obviously Irish passports aren't going to apply. For Australian passports, technically if you have 6 months validity, it's fine. But I definitely recommend trying to come over with the passport with a couple of years validity if you can, because when the permission is granted, they can usually only grant it to the expiry date of the passport. So if your passport is going to run out, you would get, you might get a 6-month permission, which would be okay, but then you'd have to go and get a new passport, make another appointment, go back, get a new card. So technically, it's not a problem. Practically, it could be just a real pain. So if it's possible, ideally, you'd have a couple of years or more of validity. It's not a massive issue. It's not going to prevent you entering or registering. It's just going to cause some of those problems that just add to the stresses of having to deal with everything. And with a big move like that, whatever you can do to make it easier, just make it easier. Darren's asked, is it correct to assume while waiting application outcomes, the Australian cannot work in Ireland? Yeah, that's correct. The permission has to be granted. And then the person will be given the right to work. So that's what I was saying about making the appointment early, because the earlier you can do it on arrival, the quicker the processing will happen. Paul was asking about entering Ireland on a visitor visa, what pre-clearance application is submitted outside Ireland. That is a really tricky one, and I've had a few queries like that. My advice would be ideally don't, because if you arrive as a visitor, even if your pre-clearance is granted, you'll still have to leave and re-enter to activate that pre-clearance. If it had to happen, I'd do it, but you basically have to plan on going back home and then coming back in with the pre-clearance. So I think what a lot of people hope is they come in on a visit visa, the pre-clearance is granted, and then they just register in Ireland, but they have to actually leave and re-enter. So it's a little bit of a tricky one. Again, it's the sort of thing that you might get away with if you went on a trip to England or somewhere else, but it just worries me, those sort of things. I'd say if you can avoid it, avoid it. If it has to be done, come and have a look, come and have a chat with us, but you might just have to expect that there could be some complications. So yeah, it's a pity it isn't quicker. When it was processed in 10 or 11 weeks, it was almost like a sweet spot of perfect timing, because it was enough to go, right, we can plan, we can give up a rent agreement here, we can sort our tickets out. 6 months does make it a little bit harder. I appreciate that. And obviously there's that uncertainty of whether it'll be granted or not. I do think if you have a long-standing de facto relationship with well more than 2 years cohabitation and other proofs, I would work in the assumption that it should be granted. If you're very close to the 2 years or a little bit under, I wouldn't make any assumptions at all. You'd want to get that pre-clearance before you make the big plans. Look, as everything, big caveat, it's up to immigration to do what they want to do. But for Irish citizens coming back, especially coming from Australia, we don't get any sense of it being a negative system. Generally, it is positively inclined, and they will want you to meet all the criteria, but they're not necessarily going to look at ways to refuse you. So if that gives anyone a little bit of hope about it being, a decent enough process to go through, it should be, as long as you can you can tick all the boxes.
Can I ask a question, Richard?
Please do.
Just in terms of that card that you were mentioning, that you would get it out in the post once you've been to the station or the office, what's the validity of that, in terms of how long can that partner or spouse, stay on the card, or is there next?
Yeah, do you know what? It's actually a little bit variable. 1 year is basically the minimum. We've seen spouses get up to 3 years. But actually, you know what? That's a really important point, because it's the first interaction and the first granting where all the work is done. If your permission is granted, let's just say for 1 year, it's very easy to renew it. If your circumstances are the same, there's no assessment really. It's a straight up, I'd like to renew it. I'm still here with my Irish spouse or partner, and everything should flow very easily. So yeah, don't get hung up on the length of time of the IRP card. I know in other countries, sometimes things are given for up to 5 years. It's never given up to that anymore, but it's not too much of an issue. It'll be very easy to renew. Another question from Paul there about things getting back to normal, processing times lessen. Actually, I think with more people looking to come back, it's likely they'll stay the same. I don't think they'll reduce. I think in retrospect, the 10 weeks was just a low demand period because of COVID. So worse luck, but you know, it's a bonus if it's shorter. So it's probably better plan for it being 6. If you get it earlier, no problems. The letter will still have a 6-month validity. And actually, if for some reason if you get a pre-clearance letter and something terrible happens where you can't go, it'll be quite easy to get another one because all the work will have been done. Bringing pets into the country, well, yeah, Sarah's just passed that one on. There's definitely work to do, right? But they've got their own system in place. Probably harder than the immigration process, to be honest, I'd say.
Actually, it can be.
Yeah.
But once you get all your ducks in a row, it should be a relatively easy process. But yeah, I suppose there's also different rules depending on whether you're coming into the country and your pets will be traveling with you, or if they're going to be traveling separately, in which case there's different rules. But those 2 links there will be useful. It might actually be a good time to say that we're going to be running 2 more of these webinars. And the next one is on the 16th of May, so next week, and that's on returning with children. So if any of you do have children and you'd like to know more about that, please join us then. If you follow us on Facebook or any of our social channels, we'll be sharing the link very shortly for that one. And then we have a third webinar as well on access to services, where we do touch a little bit on bringing pets back, but we'll really be talking about things like applying for social welfare payments and just general services like healthcare, public healthcare, and how you go about accessing that on your return. So if that's of interest, please do join us for those.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, just so Darren's saying about bringing the cats to Australia, I'd say if you've gone through the Australian system, you'll be well able to deal with the Irish one. I can't imagine it's any harder. It's probably a little bit easier, but still lots to do. And Ruth, just in terms of citizenship, good question. If you're married to an Irish citizen, you can apply after 3 years of residency in Ireland based on the marriage. If it's de facto, it's 5 years. But if you leave Ireland for more than 6 weeks in any given year, you have to discount that. So let's just say spouse gets residency on the 1st of January 2022, they'll be able to apply on the 1st of January 2025, right? But if in 2023 they left Ireland for 6 months, they're going to have to wait till the 1st of June or the 1st of July 2025 because they're discounting that time outside of Ireland. So you can add it up. You've got like a leeway of if you're married to an Irish citizen, you can accrue 3 years over a period of 5 years. And if it's de facto, you can accrue 5 years over a period of 9 years. But what's really important is 1 year prior to applying, you have to be living in Ireland. So it's not a crazy difficult process, but it definitely needs a little bit of preparation, and certainly it's well worth doing. But you do have, they're strict enough on the criteria, and being outside the country can cause some issues. But yeah, again, something we can totally talk about, and it's a fairly consistent process. It changes a little bit occasionally, but fundamentally the citizenship system is quite stable, and the changes tend to be just around the types of proofs you need to provide. The absolute fundamental criteria are stable and have been for many years, and lots of people go through the process, obviously, because Ireland has no issues with dual citizenship, so there's no risks, certainly from the Irish perspective, to anyone applying.
Okay,
Right,
great.
I've just popped in some contact details there. Sorry to talk over you, Una. So if anyone has any further questions, please do just drop us a line by email. As Richard said, we can then organize a Zoom call if you want, or you can just put your questions in an email, and we're more than happy to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. That was very clear and very easy to understand. So and I think everyone got a lot from that. So really appreciate you going through that in so much detail. Wonderful. Okay, well listen, thanks for those who tuned in and for joining us, and hopefully see you in a week's time, next Monday.
Great. Thanks, Miliona. Thanks everyone for attending. Glad we could help.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank
Nice
you.
evening.
Thanks all.
Bye bye. Bye bye.